I would like to welcome you to our PoSoCoMeS seminar. Today we are pleased to introduce the book by Magdalena Schmukalla, Communist Ghost, that was published in 2021. The book explores loss, melancholia, and art in post-communist Europe and investigates how remains of the communist past continue to shape everyday life, revealing the emotional current of European modernity. And through the contemporary art, it opens also a space to reflect on transition, on new beginnings and endings, as well about the ethical ways of relating to the other. Dr. Magdalena Schmukalla is a psychosocial researcher and lecturer in psychoanalytic studies at the University of Essex. She completed her PhD at Birkbeck College and was awarded by ESRC Fellowship to publish her first monograph that we are talking about today. And our discussant today is Liene Ozoliņa. Welcome. Joining us today, she's associate professor, doctor and associate professor at Latvian Academy of Culture. Her research focuses on post-socialist transformations, neoliberalism, and the political role of art. And she is the author of Politics of Waiting, Exploring Austerity and Freedom in Post-Soviet Latvia. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us today. And Liene and Magdalena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alina. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for inviting us, or like me, to present the book, and for Liene to agreeing to discuss it with me. And thanks for joining this discussion. It's a huge privilege to have this kind of space or maybe stage to revisit something I wrote quite a time ago. And I haven't really returned to it. I thought I hadn't, but when then returning to it and reading excerpts from the book for today's event, I realized I'm really still very much in the material that I worked with some years ago. So it kind of haunts me still. Yeah, this event will be a good occasion to think about it a little bit further, because yeah, there are things that I think when writing the book I couldn't really say or name in a way. And for those who have maybe read some bits of the book, they will have noticed that some sentences are very kind of long or a bit blurry. And I think these were the moments where I was like, okay, what is this all about? And parts of it stayed that way, and others I think I can articulate a little bit more. So yeah, so let's see how I will yeah, where this discussion will move us to. But like what I want to do now, and or like how we structure the first part of this discussion, is I will briefly introduce the book, and I will do this by reading the entry of it, like the first kind of the first words of it, and then say something about what I think my main interventions are or were, or at least the intention, and then Liene will ask some questions and maybe say something on the book from her perspective, and then we will open for more questions, hopefully, in the discussion. So as Alina said, this book is about how communism kind of is, or like a specific type of communism, Soviet type communism, which I sometimes call Europe's communism. But like how this this type of communism is still with us in some form. And I think my insistence always on calling it Soviet type communism, or some kind of Soviet type communism, was on communism as it had been practiced as a societal form. So not as in contrast to the idea of communism, or the theory of communism. So my intuition was that there's something very important that actually there have been places in Europe that tried it out, that kind of lived with this idea of, this is a communist society, or it's a society that is actually moving towards it. And suddenly it wasn't there anymore. It collapsed. So I felt that this experience of communism being there or like a socialism moving towards a communist future, being there and being within kind of groups, collectives, bodies, psychic structures, identities for many years, like 50 years in a way. And then suddenly not being there anymore was an important event that has left traces in a specific way. And that was, of course, and maybe not of course, but now I think, of course, related to how I felt personally about myself. Because I was born in 1980 in Gdańsk, in communist Poland. And my parents moved to West Germany when I was 3.5, so my father a bit earlier. So I was moved from communist Poland to Western Europe. So in a way, I think I perhaps grew up with exactly this idea that I placed now in the societal context in a personal form. Probably I was growing up with this idea that there was some kind of other experience or some other place in my life that had shaped me and it is with me in some way, but I struggled to understand it. So what I then kind of did in this book is to translate this personal kind of feeling or this uncanniness, this kind of feeling of being haunted by some kind of past into a more kind of social perspective, social project or psychosocial project, where we think of like how has this experience or this place of Soviet type communism stayed with us and how does it haunt us. So in order to kind of say a bit more about it, I actually then want to start with reading the first page simply. And this of the prologue. And the title of the prologue is Trying to Speak from a Place That Never Was. And I think I added this prologue at some later point, so it actually did not start with this. But I think once I understood what I wanted to do with the book, it was clear that, this is one way of framing it. Okay. Let me just see that I stick to the time. At some point at the very beginning of this project, my father visited me in London. I took advantage of this occasion and asked him to tell me about life under communism. It felt odd. While we would usually just start talking about it, this time, maybe for the first time ever, it was me who called him into the role of the eyewitness, trying to archive an image of what communism meant to him. We both sensed the unusual formality of this moment, but we were each of us determined to take up our roles. Me to comply with my father's inner desire to make me understand the inhuman and grotesque conditions that had made him decide to leave communist Poland. Him to tell the whole story properly and not in fragments. We tried, but the aura of this family historical moment disappeared quickly. Instead of his usual anecdotes about himself as anti-authoritarian character who would constantly clash with the structure of with a brutal communist system, stories that were sometimes tragic, sometimes funny or grotesque, and told of his creative ideas about how to circumvent regulations of the state apparatus. This time, the experience of communism was reduced to generalized statements only. Communism was something one cannot imagine, inhuman, a catastrophe, etc. I realized how I drifted away. If stories start at specific places, then maybe the place that describes the beginning of this story best is the rather unusual place of this failure of speech, that characterized not only this particular conversation between me and my father, but many of the conversations we have had or were trying to have. So I'm gonna finish here, because I think this kind of notion or this idea of a place that is formed out in moments when speech fails or when an encounter fails, I think this is something that the book tries to work with. And I think I remember the despair, like after having had this conversation, of not really being able to have the conversation with my father about to understand what it actually was, this kind of communist experience. But instead of trying to kind of know it for sure, I think I started thinking around the option of just what does it mean if we have to live exactly with this impossibility, to have full knowledge of it. And this is then how more and more I kind of started thinking around the heritage of communism as something that is not really concrete, is not one thing, and is not always the same, and that sits somehow in between, yeah, and that opens up some kind of liminal space, that I will call the post-communist threshold. And basically what I realized now, when returning to the book, is that what I was trying, I think, to do or say is that, what if we think of, and it's the first time I think I put it that way, what if we think of the heritage or the legacy of communism, of this type of Soviet type communism, and the loss of it, yeah, as a form of trauma, as something that was there, so maybe in a traumatic way, suddenly it appeared, and then it was in a similar way suddenly gone. And in addition to this, not just a trauma that sits within one individual, or one nation, yeah, but is kind of more complex in a sense, or like trauma is generally complex, but it spreads across generations, and it spreads across systems that we know. Yeah, it sits kind of between, like, since as a communist, as a thing that happened in relation to communism is not there anymore. Yeah, so that was the kind of, I think when talking about the post-communist threshold or the liminal space that opens up, after the loss of, or like the collapse of Soviet type communism, I think I was trying to find a way of speaking from the experience of trauma. And then, so yeah, and describing this space of failed speech, of something that we can exactly not really talk about, but something that is there, that is kind of shaping us and making us, I don't know, think in certain ways or feel in certain ways. That that in order to kind of relate to it or speak about it, we need different forms of communicating or thinking, or imagining perhaps our present, past, and future. And that's, so if if naming, or like if trying to give value or meaning to this disturbance that happened, by communism being present and then absent, and then kind of leaving some kind of traumatic trace, yeah, I'm giving this meaning. I'm trying to think of how can we do this. We clearly cannot do it in normal conversations, as this kind of prologue has shown. Like, it kind of trying to think, or like to speak about the experience of Soviet type communism as a trauma is difficult or impossible in kind of common forms of conversation. So we have to find other ways. And this is where I turn to art, to personal experiences, to ideas of something being unconscious and therefore only emerging indirectly. So in a way, this kind of second intervention or contribution of this book is this more methodological element of how can we speak about this specific trauma that happened to the construct of Europe or to kind of European society, but use terms that actually understand this specific event as a traumatic event. And this second intervention I call critical aesthetics, where I basically argue that we have to work with tools that do not require us to use concepts or knowledge in its common ways. And that's where I say artworks actually do that. They kind of allow us to feel or place ourselves in this kind of liminal space where speech or rational discourse fails. Yeah. So I'm gonna end here just by and then also allow Liene to say something about the book. But I want to refer to the image that is at the background because that's an image that I use in the book. And it's a photograph. I mean, if I move, you can see myself when I was 9 years old. And the picture was taken, I think, in 1989. And that was the first time we went from Western Germany back to Poland. Yeah, with our car that we had bought, like, with the money my parents had earned in the West and the new life kind of we built in the West. And I remember returning for the first time. We stopped at the border. So that's the border between Poland and East Germany, so the former GDR. And I remember my father saying, okay, we need to stop here. And he played, actually, like that was a different picture, but it was really important to him to take this picture of me standing in history in a way. He placed me in this historical moment and wanted to capture this moment of like that communism had ended and that something that he experienced as very difficult and terrible had ended, and I was kind of a new future. But in the book I write about this moment because it returns in relation to one of the artworks I discuss, and that's in the fifth chapter, I think, or sixth, I don't know. And actually, it returns this moment for me, like from the perspective of the child, returns as something quite uncomfortable, traumatic, and I remember I felt quite overwhelmed by this moment. And this is basically what I then frame as this kind of post-communist threshold of being placed at this kind of uncanny place in history where from this position of the child, or maybe from someone who embraces this liminal space, you feel parts of this kind of history happening, not in concepts, but in strong kind of affects. But these affects are not personal, but they kind of are in the place itself, in this kind of historical configuration. So and then in the book, I kind of use this approach that I call critical aesthetics, and I use an artwork to help me speak, for example, through this image. And what comes up, and it was strange, a lot in this book happened then about the trauma of the Holocaust, for example, like suddenly like all such memories came back and became part of the narrative. But this image comes back in relation to an image where my daughter when she was a child, is placed in an artwork. I place her taking a picture in an artwork that relates to the trauma of the Holocaust. So suddenly I in an interaction with this artwork, I argue that I manage to speak from this position of the post-communist threshold. So I'm doing something with the trauma of having lost or lived through and lost Soviet type communism. Maybe end here.
All right, thank you, Magda. I'll continue from here. I just have to say at the very start again how much I have been enjoying being with your book for these past few days. Again, after I had read it now a number of years back. So I'm very happy to be here and to give and to share with those also present today some of my impressions and what I really want to recognize and acknowledge about the work that you do and about this book. So I'll also start with a short quote from the book. So on page 60 of her book, Communist Ghosts, Magda writes, "Modern European thought therefore turns into an end in itself. It simply wants to see confirmed what it already knows. And it advances an institutionalized social environment in which its normative routines and patterns can be recognized and reproduced. And in this objectified and automized environment, the estranged, yet materially and ideologically powerful colonial subject uses objects and others, as Adorno writes, a mirror in which to reread itself, mistaking its own image for concretion." A bit further down on page 61, Magda continues that a spontaneous, intuitive, playful, or immediate, and with this ethical relation to and recognition of the object, of our immediate experiences, of the other person talking to us, or a social reality which strikes us as surprising and unique, is under these modern conditions not or almost not possible. Now, why I wanted to start with this, as I take on briefly this role of a discussant for Magda's book, I must admit that I think I'm a prime example of this kind of European modern subject in this respect, operating in today's neoliberal academia, quoting again, formed by a learned ideological pattern and reproducing often learned and discursively structured narratives and attitudes, using speech and thinking as social mechanisms of control. So reading Magda's work and reading this critique, as the book also advances quite a sophisticated argument, working with Adorno's thought of modern European thought, staying with this book for a number of days has been a moving and indeed somewhat disorienting experience. And disorienting is also what Magda has written, is one of the purposes of the book and of the analysis. The reading has been making me confront my own patterns of clinging to knowing and clinging to social theory as a way of controlling the world around me. Learning and creating knowledge has been for me really since childhood, and we share there's some parallels in our childhood, in addition to certain family. So really since my childhood, learning and creating knowledge has been for me a way to feel safer in the world. In addition to certain family dynamics, I think this necessity for these learned and structured narratives and attitudes was heightened for me by living through as a child the collapse of the Soviet type communism and a very messy, confusing, difficult forming of another social order. I was 8 years in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the re-established independent Latvian state emerged. So what Magda points to is the inadequacy and the often alienating nature of modern Western categories of thought and the rigid nature of our social scientific methods of knowing. I think that's one of kind of overarching arguments of the book, at least how I read it. And accordingly, the book offers a way of theorizing as well as a way of conducting research that encourages us to recognize our subjectivity, to question the disciplinary boundaries that we tend to stick to, or are often disciplined to stick to within the contemporary academia, and to reconsider our methodology. So just in a bit more detail on these 2 points, on these 2 contributions that I think the book makes theoretically and methodologically. And I hope Magda is recognizing some of this, and I'm not kind of reading it completely off, but you know, everyone of course reads kind of from their own understanding and their own place, and in fact that's part of the argument. So to me, reading the book and his book Provincializing Europe, as Chakrabarty wrote, these categories of democracy, the state, the citizen, the political time, all these conceptual categories carry imprints of a European history and European thought. They have emerged out of a specific historical context, that of Western Europe, yet we tend to treat them in social sciences as universal, as if the political, the state, liberalism, or democracy were neutral descriptive terms. As Chakrabarty argues, thought is always tied to place. And so our social theoretical concepts that we think with, they are in that respect inadequate, insufficient to analyze societies and contexts outside of the West. And at the same time, they are also indispensable, as we don't have better concepts than these same European ideas of social justice or human rights. So what we're left to is over us, expose their historical legacies and contemporary variations, and still use them despite their inadequacy in ways that we see fit to advance critical theory and to advance progressive politics. And I think Magda's book really advances this kind of post-colonial challenge to mainstream social science and to mainstream social and political thought, as she argues, quite aligned with also Chakrabarty's argument about inadequate but indispensable. Similarly, Magda writes that the post-Soviet condition is characterized by knowledge of the inadequacy and violence of European modernity on the one hand, and at the same time, the inability to leave modern European frameworks, political strategies, and concepts on the other. But the book, I think, also moves forward this kind of decolonial or post-colonial critique and offers a new form of critical theory, as it also aims to, as Magda shows how these European categories of thought are not only inadequate for thinking about those other places outside the West, but how it really is a crisis of Europe and European thought and European politics centrally right here. How European ideas of progress and orderly flow of time, of unity and freedom and liberty, how those are all haunted by these communist ghosts, haunted and exposed and called into question from these thresholds, from these post-communist thresholds, as Magda calls them. So that's the theoretical kind of overarching argument, and I think a contribution of the book as I read it, and as it helps me to think through how we do this kind of theorizing and rethinking of social theory from the vantage point of Eastern Europe. And then secondly, and as Magda also herself mentioned, the intention was it's the methodological approach that I found really worthwhile to think with, and I want to highlight, because we know in contemporary social science, we know, and we're often reminded that we need to update our ways of researching and knowing, that we need to go beyond the colonial dynamic of the knowing researcher extracting data from the external world. But often it's hard to know exactly how we're supposed to do that. We've been told, I heard this somewhere, that interviews are a zombie method. But what else are we supposed to do? How can we do it otherwise? And often it kind of it just ends with these sort of manifesto kind of statements that, you know, we need to rethink our method. But I think in this book, Magda really shows in a really creative and really compelling way how we can move beyond this kind of traditional approach of I like that comparison, how as if research was like going to the forest and picking data like berries in a little basket. Instead, how you do it in this much more kind of collaborative, creative, subjective kind of way. And so I think the way that Magda works with art and writes through art, as she calls it, is a really moving, compelling, and beautiful way how we can arrive at this, you know, what's supposed to be really the critical, the contemporary way of doing social science and humanities research. And yet she writes beautifully how art, one of the reasons why art works so well is not that it creates these better or more intelligible representations, but it does something by making us feel insecure about our knowledge. So this is going back to where I started, this sort of destabilizing, making me feel insecure about the ways that I use categories and concepts, which is in fact a way to actually allow some kind of new knowledge, hopefully, possibly somewhere, to emerge. And yet I also felt while reading the book that through all this destabilizing and questioning, Magda, as the author, speaks with a kind of voice, with a kind of authority of the doubting and vulnerable researcher that is on the one hand destabilizing, disorientating, but at the same time, you actually feel kind of safe being walked through this other way of thinking that is less disciplinary, sort of safe, and less known in advance. And at the same time, by revealing her vulnerabilities, she sort of in a brave way guides us through and makes us feel actually quite convinced that this really is a way to do work. I mean, I found it extremely brave where you in your first published book, you would reveal how the book was referred to by some more senior colleagues as a different kind of work that you would need good luck with. You know, that's a very brave stance, you know, to include that in the book. But it allows us to kind of think with you of how do we think about these super complex matters that you are trying to address theoretically and methodologically. So that's where I can wrap up and maybe pass it again to Magda, maybe with some questions. And I don't usually do this, and especially I don't like when someone does this to me. I don't think it's going to be too bad, starting with a sort of a provocative question. But it's a question that I honestly have, in the sense that I don't have an answer, and I would be honestly interested in your answer. So maybe that can kick us off. So you write about post-communism and post-communist thresholds. What do you make of the arguments that claim that post-communism or post-socialism, different terms are used, is certainly by now over? I'm thinking, I mean, there have been numerous of these kinds of papers. I mean, these kinds of arguments put forward in papers, in discussions. I'm thinking of one particularly by anthropologist Neringa Klumbite, but there are others that are making the argument in the last few years that we can no longer speak of a post-communist Eastern Europe or post-communist societies. It's no longer a helpful term, especially the new realities with the war in Ukraine, where, which has kind of reconfigured the geopolitics of Europe, with Eastern Europe no longer being some kind of periphery, but actually kind of central zones of war or potential or threatening war. So how this has made social scientists rethink the category of post-communist, and I would suspect that you wouldn't agree, but I would be interested to hear why, or either way, your thoughts on this. Oh, the microphone, okay. Yeah.
No, thanks. Thanks for first, for speaking to the book. It's been very moving and grateful, and I agree with everything you were able to describe about it. In terms of the question, I actually, I know what you mean about provocative question, and I remember when writing the book, I think I had a moment of panic where I thought, oh gosh, maybe really I'm using the wrong terms when trying to understand this kind of post-communist moment or experience. But more and more, I got convinced that in this particular conversation about the usefulness of this term post-communism or post-socialism specifically, or more generally, whenever there is this kind of think of, we should no longer speak of these terms, that actually this is the moment when one should look closely and carefully, because this is often a moment when actually something is being moved away or repressed, or where there is a strong need of moving on. Yeah. So I as doing the work, or trying to think of what actually this book is about, or what this threshold I was trying to kind of conceptualize is about. I more and more embrace the term post-communism, because I think it, and maybe, and kind of that became my theory, that maybe because it actually captures something of our present truth so well, it is a term we want to get rid of, because for me, it became a term that would point towards this kind of crisis, that the presence and then sudden loss of some kind of communist or socialist alternative to capitalism, that this term captured it. Because post-communism, I write about this also in the book, if you look only at the signifier, the symbols of it, is after the future, after communism, after, and so in a way, a paradox term, if you look at it in the context of modernity, because modernity is always characterized by there being a future you move towards, and communism was or is one of these signifiers that sits at this place. And so in a way, saying post-communism means we are post-life almost. So something, a very strange place to be in. And so my response to this wish of wanting to move away from this crisis of modernity is no. What we should do to understand what is going on is exactly to stay with it. But not as a new identity, like lots of very reactionary theorists or politicians in Eastern and Central Europe were trying to do. I found these terrifying documents or discussions where post-communism the term was used as a new kind of identity that is the real Christian European figure, better than the West and stuff like that. So not as a better identity, or not as an ethnic group or specific geographical place. In all of these cases, I agree that post-communism as a term doesn't work or is counterproductive. But in the context that I'm trying to think of it, namely as a term, as an experience that really points to the crisis we are in, since modernity created something it could not sustain, like an alternative to capitalism which collapsed, and there's nothing really replacing this other future so far. So my response is like, we actually have to own this term more and live with the difficult and uncomfortable feelings that it brings up.
Mm. You mentioned future communism as sort of certain kind of image of modern time, and it's folding as one possible future. And you write in the book also about how the end of the Soviet-style communism meant really a disruption of this flow, or this imagery of the flow of time, normal flow of time, or sort of I think you referred to Walter Benjamin and the historical time, and I think Chakrabarty also takes that concept, I think, from Benjamin, and also discusses this developmental time, and so that got disrupted, or there was no longer a kind of clear, understandable sort of proceeding of time towards something. Now, and I wanted to ask now how your thinking is proceeding, and so in the current moment we talk again, and this is now in the context of the climate crisis, about their really quite real, a really scary way of the future being no longer one that we can think about or understand in any kind of way like up to now. So how can you say a bit more about how you see this analysis that you have advanced, that you've developed, as regards the whole of Europe and its ability to think itself and its political future in this situation now, which is I mean, it was there in a way already when you were writing the book, but I feel like now, at least for me, it has struck me somehow much more lately that really I don't know anymore what the future is in a very real way, given the climate emergency. So how do you connect sort of your conceptual apparatus to this contemporary current day position we're in?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So I think what is happening, or has been happening and continues happening, is this attempt to avoid certain confrontations with certain difficulties of the system as it has. Like I call it modernity, when there are different frames for it, no? Modernity, coloniality, or like there's the European subject framed by a certain ideology or idea of how time develops and how society functions. And as I said before, and as you said now as well, this is characterized by a certain temporality, progress. We're moving along a certain line, and always towards an improved way of being. But of course, we somehow know, but consistently tend to repress that this is not true. Yeah, like this is nothing new to say that actually this ideal of modernity, this ideal of progress, of always improving the way how we live is not true. So like Adorno, for example, was one, like a modern theorist who was saying these things, but many others have said it in different ways as well. But nevertheless, there is a tendency to kind of try to avoid thinking about this. That, and maybe it has something to do with what you said before, the inadequacy of modern concepts, but also the indispensable character of these concepts, because like they're so present, so hegemonic, that in order to speak, we kind of have to use them, or in order to imagine history, the past and the future, we kind of need to work with these modern concepts. And nevertheless, there's this feeling, or this doubt maybe, that they actually don't work. So now, what I find is important, precious, and has lots of creative potential is, in this kind of post-communist context, is that there is a bunch of people, and not only those who lived in former communist countries, but like there's no strict kind of boundaries, like those are post-communist people and those not, like this is what I'm trying to do in the book as well. But clearly there was an experience, so there were bodies and groups of people experiencing communism being there as a future alternative, and then suddenly being completely lost. So everyone somehow affected by it, more or less, has made this experience of this conceptual framework collapsing. And this knowledge is somehow present in our bodies, in our public spaces, in the way how we speak, but we tend to want not to look at it. So the book kind of, by pointing the finger at the post-communist thresholds, kind of says, hey, let's do something with this crisis. Let's not try to ignore it or move away from it, but let's try to see how it kind of breaks up our language, or our kind of common ways of doing science or research, or talk about the future. And by acknowledging that it's somehow there, we can actually draw on some of the experiences, and maybe use them to start thinking differently. So, and now I'm coming to your question. So we have this very difficult situation today, which maybe should have been there already, I don't know, probably decades ago. But there's a growing awareness of this crisis due to climate catastrophe that kind of throws into our face the inadequacy of this idea of modern progress and of the future always being better. Like we're like confronted with this knowledge, rational knowledge, that the future will not be what we think it will be, and it might be like it will be catastrophic potentially. So in that case, I think this experience, the kind of post-communist threshold, becomes very important, because trying to think Europe and modern identity from this place allows us maybe to think and speak differently. And that's, I think it's even said in this blurb of the book, even though I was not thinking about climate catastrophe at that time, I was able to repress it quite well. It says, like, by being in the post-communist threshold, talking through modernity, through these artworks, we might find other ways of what we mean when trying to create better futures. Yeah, it certainly cannot happen in the way we used to do it. But again, then for this, the embodied kind of knowledge of a communism collapsing is a very important resource that we shouldn't just repress or move on to or not talk about or like find alternative identities, but like just really use it to imagine future differently.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't know, Aline, I'm mindful of time. Maybe we can open the floor for the audience's questions.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting and inspiring. It's like I need a little bit of time to think about everything. And if we have any questions in the audience, there are two ways. You can write it in a chat if you like, or you can just switch on your camera and ask the questions. So please, if someone has questions, just ask them or write them to me. Yogita?
Yes. Thank you. It was super interesting. And thank you for challenging me also to think about how I started working on post-communist transformation, and also that feeling of uncertainty, and how I also, conducting interviews with Lithuanians, I constantly expected them to talk about uncertainty and change, and they actually resisted. And now when I listened to you, I started thinking what meant collapse of communism. And the way this discussion was going, to me, it seems that there's much emphasis on modernity project and some sort of theological progress or some future. But I'm also thinking how many different things actually collapse when communism collapsed. For example, and I'm thinking through the interviews that I was conducting, how, for example, clear enemy collapsed, or clear restrictions collapsed. For example, like for a long time, when you live in an authoritarian regime, you are restricted, you cannot move, and then suddenly all that collapses. Then I was thinking about how language collapses, but yeah, I'm thinking a lot about those kind of boundaries or restrictions that people were participating in. So it's very Yurchakian understanding how, even though they did not, many of them were saying that, you know, they didn't believe in communism, etc., and still they had to play along. And that collapse of those restrictions, to me, it seems very what is supposed to be freedom. It's also very unclear, because you don't know where to move and how to move. And at the same time, it's not only about ideology, but also of practices of sociability also disappear. So there are many different things that collapse. So would you does that make sense what I'm talking? I don't know where the question goes. It just seems to me that it's not only about language, not only about project of modernity, but of many various different things. And it takes quite a lot of time to grasp what to do with that. And yes, as Lena was saying, how to, how to position yourself into that new emerging social order. But would you say that's all the same or not? Are they those rather different phenomenons or not? Or is it like one project and there are many like sides of this project? So sorry for this really not clear question, but I'm just was thinking along the your discussion and my interviews and how people talk about that period in Lithuania. anyway,
Yeah.
but thanks for the discussion.
Yeah, and thank you for this question. I think it's a very good question because it kind of really opens up the this kind of overarching big term, collapse of communism. Yeah, like, and I think the book unfortunately has to or does kind of work a lot with these kind of big terms. Yeah. Which in kind of life take on, you know, very complex forms. Yeah. So I think your question is absolutely justified. So what does this collapse of communism mean? Like, if so many forms and constellations. And yeah, so you mentioned there's suddenly kind of, yeah, restrictions disappeared, yeah, like a certain clear, like a certain form of law, yeah, and certain imagery of who is the enemy, yeah, suddenly collapsed. But what I found interesting in kind of listing these different forms, you mentioned as well that there was a certain way people learned to speak, use language, whether they want it or not. And I think this became something that I found important. And at the end, how you see or describe your enemy, or how you experience what is allowed or what is not allowed, yeah, all of this is formed by language. Yeah. And I think since it lasted like over kind of at least 2 generations, overlapping with those before and after, I think this kind of communist system, the way how it was shaped in this kind of Soviet way, actually has entered the psychic and bodily space of people, whether they want it or not. Yeah, because you often find this argument of like, yeah, but we never were happy. Like in the response of my father, no, we never were, we never liked it. We all opposed it. It's not like, I'm glad it's gone and never, you know. But what is not acknowledged is that actually, like, whether you want it or not, the system kind of shaped part of your conscious and unconscious way of being. And this took on, and this system was there in various ways, in the way how food was made. Yeah, there was the communist way of eating food, communist food, of clothes. Yeah, like there were communist ways of showing that you are in line with the party kind of law, and there's a way of showing how you are not. Yeah, so all of this was kind of a language that was shaping the system, or like trying to kind of challenge the system. So basically, I think what is more important here is in this broader context of the crisis of European modernity, is that this experience of there being a system which then completely collapsed, yeah, is something that we experience actually more broadly, but we cannot, but not in such an intensified way. So in a way, if you want, this kind of Soviet type communism, its existence and collapse, maybe can be seen as an condensed experience of what is happening to the project of European modernity more generally. There's a whole system of how we speak and arrange, yeah, the law and ideology of how we think about us as subject and others as perhaps enemies, yeah, or others as friends. That actually this system is in deep crisis, because it doesn't. We can see it doesn't work really. It doesn't. There is a glitch, to use Lauren Berland's theory, and And now, instead of pretending, oh, that all is fine, and that we just need to fix something here or something there, or that the crisis only happened there in the East, where there was this terrible communism, it just didn't work, and that's, like projecting all this crisis onto there. I think, yeah, we should find places where exactly these kind of clear restrictions or clear boundaries or a language that's supposed to work suddenly doesn't work anymore, and the boundaries turn into this blurry space. Yeah, the blurry space, and I think this is where art kind of can well sit in, or other personal kind of feelings. Yeah, where feelings can sometimes know more, like my experience as a child perhaps was more truthful to this historical moment than the way how my father saw this kind of, oh, finally this history is over, there's an end to it. And whereas my uncanny feeling maybe was more truthful, but there was no words to talk about it. Yeah, I don't know whether that was now an answer to your question.
I'm very glad to be able to, yeah, to think through the whole process and everything. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay, we have other question from Anna. Thank you very much. How do you relate to your ideas about post-communist thresholds to the rise of the right-wing sentiments?
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know whether the person who asked the question would like to clarify, because like whether it's specific about a specific type of right-wing sentiments or just generally. But
generally,
okay, good. Yeah, so the way how I hear the question, I would say the right-wing sentiments that I think at the beginning were experienced as something that is happening in Eastern countries, like all the, I don't know, I remember like when Kaczynski got into power in Poland, which happened years ago. Like Western countries still were thinking that everything is in order in the West, or like at least it was still possible to have this official narrative. But like more and more, it has become clear, like that like reactionary right-wing movements are not a problem of the East or even further away. Yeah, but like a problem of the Western world. Yeah, as we can clearly see with Trump, with the AfD in Germany, with Brexit in the UK, Italy's government, like loads of examples where you can see this kind of right-wing response becoming very powerful. So now the question is how to relate this post-communist threshold to these kind of right-wing sentiments. I would say in my fantasy or in my wish, being able to be in the post-communist threshold would mean to be in touch with a certain form of suffering and crisis, and therefore not so much a need to repress it and show strength. And I think that's a bit like for me, it's the right wing, the success of right wing movements is a symptom for a struggling social body. You know? There's lots of pain, there's lots of fear, there's lots of anxiety happening, and we're talking about a collapse of a system. Yeah, we just talked about collapse of communism as being a compressed experience of actually the system as we know it, modern Europe and in its capitalist form, kind of falling apart. Yeah, you have Zizek also talking about this welcome to end times. Yeah, this is something is dying here, and and this right-wing response is like a showcase of power, of strength, like by kind of constructing, for example, like by trying to use these concepts that we know of, like creating this idealized subject against the barbarian object or other, yeah, and using yeah, force, brutal force to defend a certain view of the world. PoSoCoMeS thresholds is exactly the opposite. It's a threshold. It's not a place of power. It's an ability to touch in a way what is painful, yeah, the wound, the trauma, and this takes away, and that's why it's also painful, like the ability to be very active, to be very responsive, to be powerful. Yeah, so it's not being in this threshold does not mean to have a better idea of how to run society. It is more about understanding where the pain is coming from. But eventually, I think that, yeah, that's this kind of other way of being progressive in a way. It also relates to what Liene asked about the future. It kind of in order to think about how we can maybe be different in this world today, how to really kind of not repeat again and again the same mistakes of trying to conquer world and conquer the environment and conquer the other. Yeah, we need to kind of first understand the pain in some way. Yeah, kind of, and that's kind of engaged with some trauma that came from the past, but also yeah, it's kind of outside of time. Yeah.
And ask, is it an attempt to rewrite the history of modernity? Is it a reaction to the collapse of the ideas of progress? But I think to some partly you already answered the question.
Yeah.
Yes, Anna writes, thank you. So I think the question is also like at this point. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Just please switch on your camera or write the question into a chat. If there are not other questions, I have my questions. I will a little bit use the position I have today. At the beginning, you were talking about European communism. So it is a kind of European post-communism. Is it different to other post-communisms outside of Europe? And the other questions, also in Europe, we had a really different kinds of communism. So the way the state responds to the society, it was different in Russia and different in Poland, or different in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia to this point of time. Do you think about that every society had this own kind of post-socialism, also responding to the way it changed to the capitalism? The ways were also really different. How and also the way of ending the communism, as like the collapse in Poland was different than in Baltic states. It was not brutal. It was brutal before, but you know, if there are differences, the Spain you are talking about, it may be different. That's what Liene was talking about, that using this these terms as like just making a kind of focal point, but the meanings can be completely different between different societies and different experiences. What it means.
Yeah, so let me explain. So I think why I used it today, but also sometimes when I write, why I use the term European communism is in response to something I observed, that there is a tendency to see, like from the Western left, I would say, to see Soviet type communism or present it in a way as if it wasn't as if it wasn't communism in a sense. It was something else. It wasn't worth the name communism. It was, and or like or it was a communism, but it was, like there are these arguments that it happened at a place where it shouldn't have happened because the capitalism wasn't developed enough, and I started seeing these as attempts to protect oneself personally, but also like a certain idealized idea, yeah, of European progressive left, yeah, from kind of the more complicated and at times catastrophic reality that happened in Soviet type communism. So by saying European communism, I try to remind ourselves that no, that's, you can't split this communism off from the real Europe, yeah, or from that would have at some point produced the right communist, the one how it was imagined. But what happened there or here is part of the idea of how, yeah, you can't split it off. So that's yeah, that's why I kind of, yeah, use it in a that I not always want to say Soviet type communism, Soviet type, like as if it was something other than Europe. And then your other question of like, yeah, there's or like there were communist systems outside of Europe, yeah, Vietnam, China, Cuba, Latin America, and yeah, or in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, there were different forms in which this communist system was implicated. And that's true. Yeah, so one cannot really say it was everywhere the same. But the same is the case for capitalism as well. Yeah, it's nowhere the same. And still, does this stop you from saying that capitalism has a certain effect on the way how life is structured, experience what it does to people? So in a similar kind of way, and I know there's a lot of danger of generalizing certain experiences, but like the point is really, but I think the other way, like having a two kind of, let's say, more scientific maybe approach to it by saying, well, but you have to be more and more specific. There's also a danger of losing this kind of more holistic view, yeah, and therefore not seeing the effect it has had on today's society.
I didn't want to criticize using this term. I'm using it as well, but I was just thinking in your as I said, it was really interesting today. So I got a really different point of view on some things, and that I was thinking, okay, in the way you are thinking, it must be like a lot of post-socialism, because it's more about your individual way of losing it. And I think this is different if you are part of the system. If you are the opponent, that's what your father said, that he is happy about it because he was kind of outside of the system. He tried to fight the system. This is completely different for the members of the Communist Party. Losing it was it's being free or getting free or being part of X system that is criticized. So I think that there was a lot of differences about post-socialism in the way you are thinking about this as like more individual thing of losing something. As then when you're thinking about like, the cut and what came after, like the transitional justice measurements and things like this, that you can more generalize and use like in this way. So I think your way thinking about post-socialism is different. So it's more individual. And the other thing, if you don't have any new questions, I was thinking about, it's like I come from Poland as well. I was spending my childhood and my part of my youth in a communism, and I was born in 76, so it's a little bit more, and yeah, I was, and I live in Katowice, so also in the 80s there was a lot of things going on. So if you are about 6, 7, you can remember a lot of those things from the stan wojenny, as we call it in Poland. So, and what I was thinking about the artists, you were talking about art. We had a lot of artists. They were really good and really famous during the communism. So the kinds of challenging the system and antagonizing the system was something they needed for the art. And after the system collapsed, they got really, really bad. So we were thinking how they could be so good. So it was like the system was on the other side, on the one hand, your enemy. And on the other hand, they needed it to create really good art. I thought it was mostly seeing about stand-up comedians or things, people like this, that after they lost the enemy, it got really bad. So I think it is the kind of what we're talking about loss, that even if you fight the system, it's a part of you. I thought it would be such an example. It was really extreme example.
It's interesting what you say. So in the context of the book, I also studied artistic production in Poland before and after the transitions in 1989, and I found it really interesting what was produced and practiced before the collapse. But I was also impressed by the art practices after. So I don't know exactly what you mean by it being really, really bad.
Not all of them, but some of them. Not all of them, but some of them. That's like they lost this enemy, and they started to make, like meaningless kind of losing this political focus, made them like, okay, there was nothing to talk about anymore. There was nothing to write about, nothing to criticize, nothing to challenge, nothing to attack. And it started like being, there was no, I don't know how to say it. There was no point of making art anymore. It was like, this is just challenging. This was something they needed.
I mean, I find it actually quite moving how you describe it, and I think when thinking about my father, for example, or people who thought that like that was their only relationship to communism, that they were critical of it, and I like relating to what you said before. I think it was always more complex. No, like it was like consciously they would, like my father would say, I hated it. It was bad. But I think it wasn't that clear, because partly it was also, shaping the good parts of him as well. So, there was also an attachment to a certain, culture there
Yes,
was
of course.
very communist. So it was more complex, but like, yeah, like the way how you describe maybe the response of artists, that there certainly wasn't this enemy, this political enemy in the form of state socialism. This is probably like how many people generally felt in terms of their role as political agents in society. Certainly there was no enemy in that form anymore, and still they felt really bad. So so I think again, I think the way how I would make sense of it also in relation to art practice, and it's also a bit like I think how I read about it, is that again there is this experience of a system collapsing. Yeah, so which does not mean that like what happened, and that's often the narrative, yeah, that after 1989, 91, everything was great. Yeah, the famous kind of end of history. Like now we've achieved the like almost paradise. Now everything only gets better, 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 better. But this wasn't the case, and I think maybe that was also specifically experienced by artists who were in a much more difficult position after the transitions, because like especially in Poland, because compared to, for example, the DDR, where the system was much more restrictive in relation to artists, in Poland they actually had a certain freedom, which also contributed in a status in society. It was like a certain privilege as well. And that was lost after the transitions. It was a much more complicated place to be in as an artist and have a voice and a form to produce in an audience. Yeah.
I think it also has to do with aesthetics, that you had a certain kind of aesthetics that you had in communism, and they could be really individual. They didn't have to, as you said, to be kind of market selling thing that people want to buy. So you are kind of out of market in this way, and some of them, of course, they didn't change, and but I think the more you were based on communism as a kind of your business, just selling, you know, the more you lost. That's the kind of artists, they didn't work so much against communism, not supporting communism. I don't mean this. I think the art was not so politically involved. It was easier for them to stay in the way you were, your artist way you were before the collapse. And I think it was more complicated for the people that were, I was saying, a lot of stand-up comedians that we had in Poland, what was really not normal, not obvious in other communistic countries, that they just couldn't find the other way of aesthetics that was really meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just ask, we have a question, I think.
Yeah, Dorota Grabelna here. I'm calling from Poland, so Polish discussion a little bit. Sorry for my English. I just have some questions. One is about the theoretical methodological frame, because you used this trauma language, which we are common with talking about trauma from genocide, which is now the subject also what is happening in Palestine, for example. So I just have this is for me a little bit suspicious. I'm suspicious to use it to my experience of being survivor of communist time. I'm 50, and from my perspective, I don't feel survivor. And I think that this is overused, this language, to some specific social experience, which probably it's a little bit trivializing for me. This experience of Jews, for example, in Poland, Holocaust and so on, and what is going on with Palestinians now. I wouldn't dare to use trauma and this language of being survivor of some political experience to such extent as this experience is located with people who just really survive their lives, their existence. And the second one, from one remark, is about collapse, the word collapse. Use you used very often to describe this this experience. From my experience and also readings, it's very difficult to say that something collapsed. Because it's this processes, a lot of processes that had place in that moment, and also this dismantles of some also art scene. It doesn't just appeared from 1989. It was the process of 80s. Yeah, it was also economic changes doesn't appear only with 1989. It was just 80s. Some in Poland, for example, the Minister of Finance put some changes also in law, allowing to privatize some aspects of economics. So it's not so easy to say that something was and now it doesn't exist. It is a process. It's also a process after 1989. That we still have some experience that we are linked to so-called communist time. So I wouldn't use this word as describing my experience. So, and the third one, maybe it's combined with the first, because I just wondering how this language which we use to difficult experience, a human experience, also like genocide, that maybe it has some limits, because the question is what's for and what we gain with that. This if this helps us, this repairs us, or maybe we just pass some thoughts of trauma to the others. And we use this experience also to something that is not helpful, but very traumatizing others also. So what's for use that to that experience? What's for use that for thinking about that time, what we gain from that? Okay, this is from me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think you put your finger on some, maybe difficult, or like, I don't know, not difficult, but unclear parts of the argument or book or the narrative. So first to this question about trauma, I think what you name is like, is there not an overemphasis or like a misuse of this concept? Yeah, like they put very different experiences into one category, which is then trauma, and these experiences can then be like very catastrophic experiences, like those made by Jews during the Second World War, today's in Gaza, and comparing these to like a a social political transition, which obviously is not the case, is not the same, and the pain that is created by one is not the same like the pain created by the other. And by using this term, I think, yeah, there is some of this is made unclear, like the difference that exists in experience and reality, is maybe blurred in the way how trauma is used, like in my argument, perhaps. And then at the same time, I think trauma is also more complex than the most terrible experience that you can imagine. It just is, I think. And there's also this idea that, like some people who experience like a violence in form of a genocide, as an individual, can live with this wound or with this violence much better than others who have experienced, like if I go like into what you said, like less disruption or less violence, who like then mentally collapse and cannot cope or commit suicide, even though there was no actual genocide. Or so what I want to say is you are absolutely right, and at the same time, I think trauma is not reduced to situations of mass murder, and I think I'm using it also because I think that there is a certain loss, that was not, or like loss or displacement or disruption of a psychic space, in the context of the transitions, that is not acknowledged or could not be acknowledged. And that's the kind of psychoanalytic definition of trauma, that there is an experience that goes beyond the means of there being concepts or ways of talking about it and processing it, working through it. That's the traumatic element. And this can have, like this rupture in available psychic means of coping can take on different forms. And I think by using this concept in this context, what I try to achieve is to say, hang on, there is things happen that we have not really acknowledged or worked through. And in doing that, we might get new and more creative perspectives on what it means to live after communism existed and then disappeared in Europe. Now, your critique of the term collapse, I think it's related to your critique of trauma. I think you're right. You're absolutely right that it was not from one day to the other. It was not from black to white. Something that we would rather associate with something suddenly collapsing. But then if you look at society on a broader scale, I mean, I think on a personal level, for me personally, it did do this from one day to the other. Like as a child, I think from one day it was there and then suddenly it was not there anymore. The smell, the kind of aesthetics, the language, but I think in a way, like obviously, if you look at the societal level, then a collapse maybe doesn't happen from one day to another. But like if you think, it was still a quite short time in which there was a radical restructuring of everyday life. Yeah. And suddenly certain symbols or signifiers were not there anymore. They shouldn't be there. And not because there was a process of debating and discussing whether it was good or bad, but there was just a decision. Certain symbols in, for example, in the west, in the east of Germany, like the ways how they used street lights, could not be there anymore. So it was replaced by Western versions of it. No, so there, without there being a process of understanding, okay, why is that not allowed anymore? So these sudden moments, I think, unexplained, illogical changes, yeah, irrational changes. I think these led me to describing it as a collapse, as a traumatic kind of collapse. And then what do we gain by using these terms? And yeah, maybe I think what do we gain, or what like in a good way, what I tried to explain, namely that we managed to maybe look at this experience again and don't see it so much as what you said, as a process that was coherent and structured and went one step by the other, but actually look at it as a messy scene where many things happened that were not as planned and as smoothless as we think, or as they are often presented. And in a bad, like looking at it critically, of course, it can also be, from my side or from this type of argument, a defense. Yeah, a defense against all the other terrible things that are happening, and presenting like myself or maybe the Eastern Europe as some kind of victim of something terrible. Yeah, both is possible, probably. Yeah. But yeah, thank you for these critical questions.
Thank you very much.
This time I was muted. Thank you very much. Do we have any further questions in the audience? If it's not the case, I would like to say thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience. It was really, really inspiring and interesting. So I hope you enjoyed it as well. And yes, in some days, and I think about a week, there will be the recordings available on YouTube, so we can see it again, or just recommend it to your friends if someone was not able to join us today. Hello. We have extra audience at the moment. Yes, thank you very much and have a nice evening. And I hope we will see each other.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, since this working group is part of the Memory Studies Association, like that Liene and I will also be on the conference in Prague, so maybe this will also be an occasion to continue the conversation. Or like, yeah.
I will definitely use this possibility to talk to you.
Yeah, it would be nice. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.